I have learned repeatedly from startup after startup that it takes 2 to 3 years. So if you have conviction around a hypothesis, don't give up so soon. Keep working, keep iterating. You'll eventually figure it out.
In part one of my conversation with Raj Singh, the co-founder and CEO of Loop Team, he talked about his efforts to make remote work feel more connected and productive. In the second part of our conversation, Raj discusses how his previous startup brought him to this remarkably prescient venture and how his company has met the challenge of the product becoming so direly relevant, quite literally overnight. Raj, I'm excited to continue our conversation and hear now more about the journey that you've been on in the last 2-3 years. Tell me, first off, was it as simple as, oh, great, I got it, we're launching now, everything's perfect, and now let's go? Or what? Can you tell me some of those kind of stepping points that got you to where you are now 3 years later?
Yeah, absolutely not that simple. It never is. Loop Team isn't my first startup. Won't be my last. Usually what I tell people is find an area that they find interesting. And so for me, it was sort of, this married two different things that I found really interesting. One is meeting productivity, which has been a passion area for me for quite some time. My last company was a calendaring company called Tempo that was acquired by Salesforce. But the second thing was this remote work phenomenon. We had a partially distributed team in my previous life. And I could see that this was going to be picking up. I didn't know it was going to accelerate this fast with COVID. And so this sort of married two areas that were of personal interest. So then really the next step after that was like, okay, what exactly do we want to build, or what is this going to look like? And so we just started swimming. What I like to use the swimming analogy. And the reason I like to use that analogy is if you think of a river, you can either be going upstream or downstream. And so it's much better to be going downstream. So go with the market trends instead of fighting the trends. And so you just start swimming in that direction. And then another sort of metaphor that I like to use is I really think of us like we're Jello. And then over time, it starts hardening as it's like flying through the air, right? So like little bits fly off and whatever, and you start sort of taking shape. So we just started swimming in this direction of saying, hey, we need to build something to just allow more communication and transparency. And so we had built a, let's call it at the time, a web conferencing looking tool that was doing transcription, and it allowed you to share the meetings after the fact. And it was really about sort of creating more information transparency across your team. And then as we started diving in, we said, hey, part of this experience is just the speed of interaction. Part of this experience is the presence. And it just started getting hardening further and further and further. And it's an iterative process, and in every startup I've had, it's never not taken 2 to 3 years before you sort of start figuring out if this is going to work or not, because that's just the time it takes to just kind of go through that process. And there are some resets, and there's a couple places where you might take 2 steps back, 1 step forward, or 1 step, whatever it is, or 1 step back, 2 steps forward. Sorry. And in the meanwhile, you're revising your messaging and positioning along the way, but it does ultimately harden. And you do get to a point where you can kind of say, this is my positioning, and this is where we're seeing people using it and how they're using it. And it's very sort of concrete, and people get it. And I think this is consistent across all startups. I don't think any journey is unlike what I'm describing.
This being your second startup, what hurdles do you see next you're going to have to overcome that you were already able to do and that another entrepreneur could learn from?
I get this question asked a lot. It's like, hey, Raj, you've been doing entrepreneurship for a long time. I dropped out of master's to start my first company in 2000. I tell them each startup had a different sort of primary learning experience. It's really hard it'll take a whole hour to go through each of them, but there are some patterns. One thing certainly is team. It's really important to make sure, especially the early folks that you bring on your team, are people you think you can work well with, but people who also can push you in the right direction and be contentious when they need to be contentious, but not sort of get to a point where it's like very hard to get any work done and you're just arguing all the time. Whatever. Team is really, really sort of important. And your best friend may not be your best teammate. And that's very key. And that was a lesson out of my first startup, which was out of all college roommates. And then it just became an egotistical match just because of our age, being 20, 21 years old and all of that, right? So Team is super important. I think too, I think a lot of people get stuck in analysis paralysis, which is sort of like, I want to do something, but I'm not sure. And I look into it and I spend 3 months and I kind of give up, and then I move into some other idea. And I have learned repeatedly from startup after startup that it takes 2 to 3 years. So if you have conviction around a hypothesis, don't give up so soon. Keep working, keep iterating. You'll eventually figure it out. Number one reason startups fail is they run out of money, but number two reason is because the founders get tired. And so if the team gets tired, you just sort of step back. But so if you persevere, you will figure it out. You'll figure out an opportunity. And niche is only niche until it's not niche, right? And we see that all the time now. Little ideas that people are like, yeah, maybe 1% of the population would be okay with renting out a room in their house for a vacation. And the next thing you know, it's Airbnb, right? So that's how these things sort of start. I would say, and that was what I'm describing here, this analysis paralysis, definitely a lesson from my second startup. My third startup, I remember indecision, or not my third, my last startup was sort of something we hit. Indecision kills startups, which is a really, it may not make a lot of sense, but it actually, as your team grows, it's really important to communicate a decision. When you don't make a decision, it actually creates anxiety for other people. So if you're not, the natural tendency of companies is to, or sort of first-time founders is to, on hard decisions, to just delay. Like, not sure if we should do this, or not sure if we should do that, or not sure if we choose this or choose that. So we just delay. And then they delay and delay. And next thing you know, it's kind of too late. It's actually better to make the wrong decision. Just make a decision. If it's wrong, it's okay. But at least now you can say we tested it, or we did it and it didn't work, and then we pivot, because it creates a lot more focus around the team.
Curious then, as over the years, where have you learned these different insights? What books have you read, podcasts you listened to that kind of are your favorites, or you've really enjoyed?
I enjoyed The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I think that was from Ben Horowitz. There's a variety of popular business books. I increasingly don't read them. I read the cliff notes, because I found, you read a Malcolm Gladwell book on the blink moment, but really the rest of the book is just reinforcing the first chapter, which is kind of really what it's about. And so I do look at a lot of the cliff notes, but I will say, doesn't matter how many books you read, you're going to make the same mistakes. You could go read Jack Welch's biography on managing, high performing teams or whatnot, and what he did. And your team grows, and you're going to make the same mistakes. You're going to create OKRs and do all that, whatever, but you're going to make the same mistakes. And the reason is you just can't, it's hard to apply what you read in real life. When you're actually in that situation, emotions come into play. What your gut comes into play, things that you may not recognize or realize. And so you do need to, scar tissue is real, and you have to get some scar tissue. But one thing for sure that happens with repeat entrepreneurs, with your first startup, every time you have an up or a down, it's like super exciting, or it's like, you're super depressed. You get a little bit better about managing that. You get to a point where few things make you really excited. You're happy, whatever, things are growing, but few things make you really depressed, because you're so used to the ups and downs after a while. I hate to say it, you almost become sociopathic, because you become sort of emotionally immune to the roller coaster. But my best advice here is, the books are great. Maybe read the cliff notes. You don't need to read them in detail, but honestly, what's even better is just to go start building.
Awesome. Last question I have for you. What kind of tech innovations do you predict we will see, overall tech innovations, in the near term, next year or so, and long term, like 5-10 years?
Over the last 5 to 10 years, they've been talking about AI. That's a term that obviously comes up a lot. And I feel like we're hitting a point where it's moving from a category to a layer. And I think that's a big deal. And what I mean by that is, for a long while, it was only XYZ engineers who could do AI. But now the tools and the frameworks have improved so much surrounding AI that people out of college, people in college, high school kids can incorporate elements of AI into their experience. And I think this is going to have significant sort of productivity gain across the world, from very simplistic things, to I don't know, self-driving cars, as we talked about. You can think of it as simplistic, to more complicated things. But just the thought experiment I like to tell people is, envision a product in your house, anything you can think of, your clock, whatever. How would that product become better if it had access to AI? Like, what would it do differently? What would it do differently if it had access to location, or if it was connected online? And Amazon's been doing a great job pushing our minds forward here. They've taken all these devices and made them internet connected. But really the next step is AI. If I walked to my fridge, how could it do better if it had AI? Well, certainly it could reorganize everything in the fridge for me, to make it easier that the expired items come to the front, or whatever it is, right? And so that's always a good thought experiment to think of. And I think this trend is not sort of next year, it's going to be going on for the next 5 or 10 years. But I think, an analogy I used to use is in 2007, when the App Store came from Apple. It was 2009, but before Apple, even the carriers at app stores, they used to have a category called location. And these were applications that used location data. And today, it's sort of hard pressed to even think of like what application wouldn't benefit from knowing location, right? Everything uses location data. The same thing is happening now in AI.
Have you seen a company using AI, machine learning, or other technology to transform the way we live, work, and do business? Go to uptechreport.com and let us know.